Okay. Oh, it looks like our participants are saying
sorry.
they can hear us. Okay. Well, hey, everybody, welcome. We're just getting warmed up here.
Yeah.
Oh, I've been promoted to a panelist. All right. Do we have the other participants in yet, Samantha?
We do. We've got 21 on.
Okay. And can I share my screen?
We're having issues with that. I'm still working on it.
Okay. Well, let me do this. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session in the Book of Life virtual series. COVID has made all of us have to adapt and change some, but we are delighted to be coming to you virtually via Zoom. And I want to thank our participants that I'll introduce in a moment, Reverend David Achada and Susan Latta. Let me begin with a little bit of a personal story. I was contacted by a mutual acquaintance, Dr. Tyler McCurry, about a friend of his who is writing a book about grief, and he wanted to talk to a hospice doctor. So we arranged to meet, and it turned out that when we started talking about grief, I said, you know, I'm happy to answer what questions I can, but we've got a lady who's like, this is her thing. This is what she does. And so I put a quick call into Susan and said, could you come over to my office and chat with this gentleman? And she did. And after we were having the conversation, we said, you know, this would be a wonderful opportunity to do education around grief for our Book of Life series. So David is a ICF certified executive coach, specializing in helping leaders gain clarity around their vision and implementing simple transferable people strategies. He's worked with a variety of companies, and he's also unique because he's an ordained minister with a DMin and has worked 20 years planting churches as a pastor and church planter in Florida, Washington, and California. And it was his mother's passing that brought him back to Tennessee from his wanders. And Susan Latta, who I had the joy of working with for the last 4.5 years, she's been here a lot longer. I've only been here 4.5 years. Is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's been in private practice, worked in hospitals, worked in hospice. She does one-on-one grief counseling. She's been working for 39 years. And she facilitates grief support groups and she is a fellow in thanatology through the Association of Death Education and Counseling. And so we want to thank the two organizations that directly contributed to our this particular conference. I also want to thank the members of the board of the Book of Life, which include Chris Grant and Chris McWhorter from the Southeastern Area Agency on Aging, Reverend Louisa Parsons with St. Francis Episcopal Church, Reverend Keith Munford, who teaches chaplain students at Erlanger and Hospice, Susan Day, who is on our foundation, Samantha Bond, Betsy Kamadiner at CHI Memorial, and Lynette Carlson at UTC. There will be the opportunity for a survey after the seminars and also a certificate of participation. I do want to mention, since this is the Book of Life, that we have other books listed around theology and healthcare, particularly end-of-life care, on our website, and you are welcome to look at that and get other suggestions from previous speakers we've had. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I think, Susan, you're starting?
I am.
All right, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So honored to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps, for asking me to be on board. I love to talk about grief and educate, and I'm looking forward to dialoguing with David throughout our time today. I wanted to start with a quote by Rabbi Earl Grolman. It says, "Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love, the only cure for grief is to grieve. And I just think that's so poignant, especially in our world where we don't like talking about death. We don't like talking about grief. And I have to remember that I am an anomaly for many people I come in contact with, because I am very, very comfortable talking about grief and death and all that happens in that world. So I wanted to start a little bit about talking about some of the normal reactions that people often feel, especially early on with grief. Many people will come in when we were meeting in person. Now it's the last 7 months has been on Zoom or phone calls or whatnot. But many people come in, especially within the first month or two after someone significant has died, that just feel like their whole life is like in a vacuum. And they often talk about just kind of being almost numb to grief. And I often refer to that as kind of a grief fog. And for some people, it may be just for that first week after the death. It may be 3 months after that death, depending on that person and who they are, their own constitution as far as emotionally and physically and mentally and whatnot. But a lot of people feel that grief fog. And then when the fog lifts, all of a sudden it's like the death just happened again. And so for those of you that are on board, to be really mindful of that. It could be, 3 months down and all of a sudden the person is not doing well because it just feels like they've just been told or they've just acknowledged that whoever in their world has died. Some of the most common reactions with grief is poor concentration. So you have people in our world, typically you get 3 days of bereavement leave if you're working for an organization and they have that. And then you're supposed to go back to work and just pick up. And for a lot of people, that is really difficult. I remember my dad died last year, and it was 59 days after my stepdad died, and they all live out in California. And when I came back, I was very fortunate because this is my world. But when I came back, I said to my colleagues, I don't think I can do dad deaths right now, as far as, following up on people. And so they took over and they, took care of the dad deaths that were assigned to me or that I was asked to connect with. And it was probably a couple months later that I said, I'm good. I'm okay now. But I was able to recognize that talking about a dad's death with somebody else may have been a trigger for me. And that just wasn't, that just would not have been helpful for the person, and it would not have been helpful for me. But remembering that we do have a lot of people do not, they're not able to verbalize some of their needs around grief. So poor concentration is one. I feel like my mind is on a merry-go-round and cannot stop. That's another thing. And that includes a lot of with sleep and whatnot. My mood changes at the slightest moment. I'm okay, and then boom, I start crying. There's a term that I use a lot. It's called SUG moments, S-U-G, sudden unexpected grief. And those SUG moments are affiliated with our senses. So things that we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. So a couple weeks ago, I was talking to a dad whose 12-year-old son drowned over the summer. And anytime a parent loses a child, it is, for any death, it's horrific. And a child death, it's different and has its own complications with all that. And so he was sharing with me a story that he had gone to the grocery store and had gone down the cereal aisle and picked out a box of Honey Nut Cheerios. And he stood there with this box of Honey Nut Cheerios and just started sobbing because he realized that his son, who had died, was the only one in the house that ate Honey Nut Cheerios. And he was never going to be buying another box of Honey Nut Cheerios for his son. And he said, I almost just left the grocery store and went home with the, you know, my cart full of groceries. And I said to him, I cannot tell you how often I have heard people leave their full grocery carts and run out to their car because they've had a sad moment. So just to remember that sudden unexpected grief comes with a lot, and it's very, very, very frequent early on. Some of the some of the physical effects around grief have to do with a lot of sleep difficulties, eating difficulties, a lot of, especially physical exhaustion, a sense of just, oh, well, that's not so much physical, but heart palpitations and anxiety and just agitation, not knowing what to do with all that. Those are some very, very common reactions physically to grief. Some of the behavioral is people often say they want to dream about the deceased, and sometimes people do, and sometimes people don't. I worked with a mom for a long time whose son had been murdered, and she said, I just want to have a dream about him. And it had been probably 9-12 months after he had died and had been murdered. And she came in one day and she said, I finally had a dream about him. And some people do and some people don't. And I don't know why they do and why they don't. But that is something that some people really want. Disorganization, absent-minded, increase with chemical abuse, increase with not just alcohol, but drugs. You have to be really just mindful of that. And then some of the emotional responses are just a lot of sadness, a lot of anger, a lot of helplessness, feeling abandoned, a lot of despair and ambivalence. So those are some of the, very, very quickly, some of the implications of what grief is. And I'm going to turn it over to David and let you go ahead and share your story.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Great introduction to a lot of the things in my story reflect almost exactly what you're sharing. And for our, participants, the book that I've just put out on the subject is right here. It's called In the Caverns, and the subtitle is The Darkness of Grief and the Dawn of Life Change. And I'm going to give you in about 15 minutes a summary of 200 pages or so. So I'll do my best. But my goal isn't to retell every detail of it, but more of to share the experience about how a full-grown, competent adult male can spiral into a blubbering, blundering, useless person. And I can laugh about it now, but in the moment, it was absolutely confusing to me. So Greg gave a little bit of my background. Actually, I don't have a DMin. That's an MDiv, but I wanted to throw that out there so nobody thinks I'm stealing a degree. But I worked as a full-time minister for 10 years before I felt a call to church planting, and as a way to figure out how to finance that life. I ended up finding myself in the corporate world and working with a number of different companies and a lot of different industries. And as that business began to get off the ground, I was able to finance a life of church planting, which is what I felt like I was called to do. So it was a really fun life, being between a lot of different things. We had made a cross-country move from where I worked at the time, which was in Orlando, all the way out to near Seattle, Washington, where I was starting my business. And then a few years later, we moved down to Southern California to plant a church down there. And so everything I described to you is probably material for a whole other book, because the adventures that took place during that time were just so many. But what happened was that 5-year period dealt our family a lot of blows, a lot of starting over, a lot of financial difficulties, to where we had finally gotten to a place where it seemed like we were getting kind of steady. And as we were in Southern California planting a church, slightly less than a year into us moving there, my sister called me and she said, Mama's not doing good. You need to go check on her. Well, she lived here in Chattanooga, and I was in Southern California, and I had to work with an executive client out near Asheville, North Carolina. So instead of flying, I said, why don't we just take a road trip as a family and we'll go see her and see how things are going. And so we made the trip out here to see her. And what I found was just such a shock and a surprise, because my mom was a really tough lady. She would never ask for a lot of help or let us know if there were any major issues. And when we saw her, the way that I describe it in my book is she looked like a skeleton wearing lipstick. She was so skinny. She had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She had overcome it a few times, and it had kind of surged back. And I think I have the ability to show you guys some pictures to give you an example of what we're facing here. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. That's my mom right there. That's when she was strong and healthy. That's probably somewhere around 1979 or 1980. And that's my mom, Carol Machado. Some of you may know her. She worked in public health for many years here in Tennessee. And that's little me, my sister Sonia, my other sister Wendy. And this is the mom. You know, the way the emotional brain works is this is what we remember when we remember our parents. And what I found actually was something more like this. This is us in the same wheelchair. That's how skinny she had become. And as I began to try to figure out what I was going to do about this, my life really flashed before me. Because this is the life we had just left. Right here, this is our house in Southern California. And we had moved there to see a church like this planted, where people gather in homes, people open their lives in a relationship. We just had our first corporate beach gathering with some of our neighbors. So we were anticipating a whole different kind of life. And I'm kind of ashamed to admit it now, but when I saw my mother, I more thought about myself than about her. I thought about what we were losing. And I immediately kind of stuffed it. And I got to work. And as I got to work, I really didn't have a lot of time to think about myself. Up early, visits to the doctor, also trying to figure out how am I going to run a business? How am I going to keep this church going? We're starting. So I did what any good soldier would do. I ignored all the pain. I ignored all the body symptoms, all the exhaustion. I began to fly back and forth across the country 5 days a month. And I began to work with my church from afar on the phone. I worked with coaching clients on the phone. I worked in the waiting rooms of the hospital. I tried to get as much done as I could. I was only able to make about 3 trips like that. And then it was just too heavy for me to leave. And as I began to more fully embrace the needs my mother had, I really stopped taking care of myself. And I've learned since that there's been some studies on caregiving, that there's around 43.5 million caregivers in our country every year. There's an organization called IonaCare that my friend Dr. McCurry told me about. IonaCare stands for I'm Not Alone Care. And the founder of that organization had a very similar story to mine. And I just didn't know what to do or who to ask for help. I felt very alone, very isolated. Well-meaning friends would say things like, let us know what we can do to help. And I'm thinking, like, I don't really have time to think about how am I going to call you or ask you for help. I'm up in the middle of the night. I'm up early in the morning. As my mother's strength began to deteriorate even more, she couldn't even stand on her own anymore. And so a few months into my time, I found myself using all my strength just to actually get her around. And actually realized on my last visit home that I had not been eating properly when all my friends and my family said, "You look really skinny." I brought up a picture. I'll show you guys here. Go back to my screen sharing. That's how skinny I was. I'm a skinny guy, but I was even skinnier here.
Mhm.
This is the last visit home.
Mhm.
You know, we have to let these pictures sort of sink in. Last time I would see my kids for a few months. In the course of about 6 months, I saw my kids 3 times. And so there's a whole other set of issues happening internally. My body's deteriorating. My kids are growing up. I don't know the names of their teachers, of their friends at school. And and I wasn't taking care of myself. This is what my day looked like normally. That's me changing out fentanyl patches.
Mhm.
And on these types of days, however, in the midst of grief, what I found was that it was kind of like the porthole that enters into Narnia, where you start to learn these things that it's not possible in the normal world. And so with these few visits I had back and forth, I started to notice this type of porthole that began to open and close. And the deeper I would get into suffering, the more it would open. And I can tell you, it was like one of the most special times in my life, as difficult as it was. I felt super sensitive to the voice of God. I felt very in tune with my mother and her needs. But the reality was we were living a hard life together. I compare it to like wounded soldiers trying to get out of a battlefield, dodging landmines and bullets, you know. And, you know, this whole season of time lasted 5 months. And it was my last probably 6 to 8 weeks or so where I was in this full time with no trips anywhere else. And I remember when the hospice nurse came to visit. By the way, love hospice nurses, and helped us get my mom settled. This is actually her last day of life in this picture. I remember feeling so overwhelmed, I didn't know what to do to stop the pain. I felt like I was trying to have to administer all this medication I didn't understand. Thankfully, they helped me learn to navigate it. And a few days before she died, I was given a really great little pamphlet called Gone From My Sight. And it helped me understand the process of dying. And I wish I would have gotten it about a month earlier. It would have made a lot more sense because I think we'd already been through a lot of those stages. But I remember the nurse saying to me, you want to keep giving her this medicine because she's transitioned and she could potentially be brought out of this transition if there's too much pain. And so my mom was kind of hovering in between worlds. And if you can see right here, her hand is slightly raised off the bed. And the interesting thing is in her last 1 to 2 days of life, as she kind of hovered in this in-between world, others will tell you that people who are dying often do reach out for something unseen. And so I just knew I was in this really special, special holy place. And she died about a day after this picture was taken. And the crazy part about my story is that you think that that's where it ends, you know, but the reality is it doesn't end, because when a loved one dies, especially if it's a parent, it can make you feel like a little kid all over again. You just don't know what to do. And what made it even harder was that the death occurred around the holidays. So all my family came into town wanting to help clean the house, deal with things. And when people are grieving, they say and do all sorts of crazy things. And what made it hard for me was I didn't feel like I was able to really say or do my things, because I was sort of like the mediator of the family. And so I had to postpone dealing with my stuff for about a month. And after everybody kind of cleared out, I took a retreat went back home, and my wife was super supportive, and she said to me, "What do you need? You just do what you need to do." And I got back to my home in California after being gone for 6 months. And I took a retreat to Joshua Tree National Park. And I went out there thinking I was going to plan my year, get back on track, you know. And I got to Joshua Tree National Park, and I just sensed the voice of the Holy Spirit say to me, "You're not here to plan. You're here to grieve." What I want you to do is I want you to walk around for a few days like the Old Testament prophets. And I want you to kind of figuratively cover yourself in sackcloth and ashes. And I want you just to be sad. Be sad for what you've lost. Be sad for your health. Be sad for the loss of your mom, of the time with your family. And my wife knew I needed this, because in the days following my mom's death, I began to wake up in the middle of the night, attack mode. It's time to go help somebody. I would hear in my mind, my mom had a bell during that time to get my attention if she needed something. So I'm picking her up off the floor, helping her with issues. In my sleep, I'm hearing this bell, ding, and I'm waking up, going to give help. But I was also having these really weird nightmares. And I had been alone mostly for 6 months. And I remember this one particular nightmare. I'd wake up in kind of a half sleep, half awake zone. And I was looking at my wife, and in my mind, she looked like the body of my dead mother. And she woke up one time, my hand was close to her face like this, because I was trying to see if she was breathing. When she opened her eyes and said, "What are you doing?" the dead face of my mother transitioned to become the younger face of my wife. And this happened repeatedly to me. And as I reflected on that and took that time away to grieve, I realized this was going to be a longer term project, because I was thinking I was going to have a heart attack. I ended up in the hospital thinking like I am having a heart attack. My heart is racing all the time, just like you said, Susan. Perfectly young and healthy, the doctor said. And when she asked what was going on, if I was under any stress, I described everything I just told you. And she said, you might benefit from getting into a quieter environment. She said, your body's perfectly healthy, but from what you've been through, you probably need to get out of a place where a lot of things are expected of you. Mm-hmm. And I found a local grief recovery group at a hospital, which was super helpful to me. And that enabled me to work through some stuff. I found a couple of bad grief groups as well. One of the facilitators said, you got to be here every meeting for 12 weeks or else you can't join. And I was already writing to figure some things. I was taking these retreats, and I said to this guy, it's too much. I can't do this. But I found this other grief recovery group where the chaplain said, just come one day at a time, one meeting at a time. Grief and loss is hard. And I heard that and I thought, man, this is my best friend right here. Because I couldn't think about what was going to happen 3 months out So I began to take this time to write. It's my mom right there. I'd sit down. I took some time off, took about 3 months off initially, did a few coaching calls on the phone, but took a break from leading a church. And I began to sit with my computer and a picture of my mother. And I just started writing. And it was just my journals, and eventually turned to the book that exists now. And as I began to do that, my wife helped me understand I was learning to deal with my grief through kind of a side door. There's like a top down, a bottom up type of processing. My wife is right now getting her master's in counseling with a focus on trauma therapy. So I'm learning a lot of great stuff from her. And the top down processing is like talk therapy, where we talk it out and we make it make sense. But the bottom up is kind of where we get in touch with our bodies and our breathing, and we exercise, and it helps us learn some things we couldn't learn otherwise. But the side door is kind of like storytelling. So when we tell stories and we realize things that we couldn't have realized before. And so I just took time to write stories, to write my thoughts, and it started to make more sense to me. I started to do a better job taking walks, listening to my body, listening to my breathing. And I did this in a way I'd never done before, so that I even took better vacations with my family. I wasn't ever really good at being still and taking time away. I was always working. This is what it looks like to see your son after not 6 months. We took a trip to Sequoia National Park. I remember noticing how grounded I felt. Like I felt so present all of a sudden. So I'm writing, I'm taking trips. But what also was happening was I started to forget things because I was so exhausted. And I started to get lost. It was normal for me to go out for a walk and not remember how to get home. And this began to happen month after month after month. 6 months after I returned home, even in the midst of doing all this stuff, my friends, my family came to me and said, "You should be getting better by now. We're really concerned about you." And we called together everybody, and we prayed and we processed it. And with the help of our friends who had gone to see this church planted with, they were the ones who actually said to us, "You need to get into a quieter environment." So we made the very difficult choice to integrate that new small church into another church and move, specifically for the purpose of integrating the grief, not to avoid it, but to integrate it. And we moved back to Tennessee, to this area. My wife made me this sign right here. It says Jesus' words from Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The Eugene Peterson says, the Eugene Peterson paraphrase says, "Come learn the unforced rhythms of grace." And that actually now hangs on my bookshelf, which is right behind my head up here in the picture. And the reason this hangs above our bookshelf here now is because I have learned through this process to stop trying to force stuff to happen. And the last thing I want to add on this, because there's a lot to unpack in this story, the last thing I want to add on this is, in the closing of my book, I reference Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And what Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning is, he said, people often ask, what is the meaning of life? He said, but asking that question is a naive query because it assumes that life owes us something. Mm-hmm. He said, but in the death camps, we found that meaning was found in embracing the cycles of life and death. And, you know, we as humans, we're meaning-making machines. Mm-hmm. Our mind is always trying to make sense of things. And when our minds can't make sense of something is when we die. We just can't handle it. We cannot handle a life that makes sense. Frankl said in his book, there's one man who had a dream the war was going to end the next day. And when he woke up and that day came, the man died. Because he had based his whole existence on this endpoint. And when it didn't happen, he couldn't handle living anymore. And so where is meaning found? And what I found through this process was meaning is found in embracing the cycle of life and death. And I think King David said it well in Psalm 23 as a closing point here. He said that I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Now, here's the thing about valleys. Valleys are dark. They don't make sense. And when things are dark and they don't make sense, it's an indicator we are in the valley of the shadow of death. We have lost something, a job, a loved one. And from the time we're young, we start losing things. And in our culture, we don't do a good job with losing things. And so I have a PhD psychologist friend who shared with me, she said, because we're not good at losing things, then when the real losses come, we have no practice. We don't know how to do it. And when my wife and I moved to Tennessee with our family, what we chose was to embrace the cycle. And we took 1.5 years off of pastoral ministry. I still did my consulting work, but we took that time off to embrace the cycle. And the cool thing about it was that had ripples that I'll tell you about in a second when Susan and I talk a little bit more, but it had ripples that went over into other areas of life. And, you know, the word I want to give to our participants, our listeners, is we're surrounded by people who are grieving, who have lost something. Mm-hmm. And we've got to encourage them to take the time to feel it. When we can feel it, then we can navigate those emotions and we can come out into those green pastures that Psalm 23 talks about. So I've got just a couple of takeaways that I wrote down here. I think we got to feel the cycle, right? I think the cycle of life and death, and embrace it. We got to take care of ourselves, getting exercise, breathing, and making space for one another. One of the great things that happened to me during this time is, as I was writing, I had my friends there at our church. They would say, "What are you writing? Will you read it to us?" It was the best thing possible because it gave me an opportunity to integrate the things I was thinking into my life and to make sense of things. Mm-hmm. And so I love and I miss those friends dearly. But I'm so thankful for them because they had the courage to say to me, "You're not doing well. We're concerned about you." And after taking that 1.5 years off, we planted another church. And so we're here in Chattanooga, and we've got another church called Kairos Church. And the interesting thing about that church is that the way that it was formed, there's a core that existed before my wife and I arrived, but we brought in a different set of people into that group who knew why we had moved here. And they were asking questions. What are you dealing with? Why'd you come here? And it really brought a whole new level of understanding to leading from your weakness and from your brokenness, because people want to be with other people who are dealing with their things. And the neat thing is that we brought a whole neat group of people into our church, or at least connected relationally in some way to our church, who also wanted to deal with their things because they saw us dealing with it. And so when we deal with our grief, we make space for others to deal with their losses as well. So I'll stop it there, and maybe Susan, we can interact a little bit around that.
That sounds great. So one of the things that I'm curious about, David, is prior to when your mom died, there's a term called anticipatory grief, which basically is the sense that as the person is, if I was given a diagnosis of a terminal disease, I would start grieving at that point. My family would start grieving at that point. And then as the disease process was continuing, then I would be, I might have to stop driving. That would be a huge thing for me right now, just because of my independence. But I'm curious, were you able to recognize kind of that process of anticipatory grief for yourself, for your family, for your mom, your sister? Did you see that much?
Yeah. My younger sister had been helping out with my mom's cancer off and on for 3 years. So I think she had already dealt with a lot of things that I hadn't had to because I hadn't lived near it. My older sister, probably had more anticipatory grief because she hadn't been next door to it. And I had a lot of it. Like I mentioned earlier, to me, it was the anticipation of the loss of my mother, but also our whole history. We had some land here in Tennessee in the house I'd grown up in, but also the loss of all the work that I'd put in to get to California and to get to planting this church. And so we had these layers and layers and layers of things that we were, me in particular, I was thinking about losing. And I think that ultimately that's kind of what blew my fuses. Was I wasn't worrying just about loss of a parent. I was worrying about the loss of all these particular things.
Right.
So when I share with some people, I'm like, yeah, it was kind of like triple or quadruple grief is what it was for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think of what your statement was when you first saw your mom and how thin she was.
Yeah.
And just that, it kind of almost like it took your breath away. I don't know if that's true, but that's what it sounded like when you described that earlier.
Oh yeah, it was exactly like that. When I saw her for the first time, I remember having two thoughts immediately. Thought number one was, why the hell has no one told me about this?
Yeah.
Anger. Like, if I would have known this, I would have been here a long time ago.
Yeah.
The second one was, what about my life? What are the implications of this going to be for my life?
Right.
And then the accompanying emotion was shame. Why are you thinking about yourself? Look at this. You got to deal with this. Mm-hmm. And so I immediately got to work, which obviously caught up with me.
Right. So that's really interesting because I don't know if you've ever heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a psychiatrist that came from Switzerland and came over in the early 60s. And she kind of came up with the 5 stages of grief. And people are now using it after the death, but really for her, it was working with individuals that had been given a terminal diagnosis and were dealing with their pending death. And so the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And some people think that you have to go through those 5, in a row, and you don't. People bounce all around it. But it's so curious to me, as I've, been in this world with hospice for 17 years, of watching people say, I've gone through the anger stage and now I'm in the bargaining stage. And I don't know, like, if you experienced any of that, if you were identifying things as you were going along, or were you just trying to hang on there and as you were taking this ride that nobody really wants to do, but you were definitely in.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that, Susan, is that in writing the book, I've learned how unusual it is. I was 37 at the time, how unusual it is for a 37-year-old man to take care of his mother. Mm-hmm. Most of the people who are buying my book are 65-year-old women and older.
That are taking care of their spouses. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I think that in light of, I was really at the peak of my youthful productivity years at that point. And so I think that rather than feeling the stages of grief that you're describing, I'm more sort of acted out the stages of grief. Mm-hmm. Jesus says, a tree by the fruit it produces. So the fruits of my life were showing that I was dealing with all those stages. Mm-hmm. Like, I would talk to my mom and be like, hey, why don't we just sell everything here and you come move to California with us? And she knew about it, I didn't, So in a way I'm bargaining, right? Like, we can sort of like find a way to work around this, or there's these other times where something would happen that would just make me fly off internally and just make me so angry at the situation. Mm-hmm. There's a, older woman living out in the woods. Her property was really unkept and a lot of down trees and things. I remember this one afternoon, I was so angry that I was stuck in this environment. Mm-hmm. I remember going outside. I hadn't done much physical labor in years. I lived in cities. Here I'm back at East Tennessee in the country. And I've got this huge, heavy steel chainsaw. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to murder so many trees out of anger today. And it felt so good because someone was paying. I was so angry. Someone had to suffer those
Mhm.
poor trees, So I cleared 8 acres of land. I cleared a 1.5 mile section of trail out of
Wow.
anger.
What a great way to channel your anger.
That's
Because if you
right.
don't channel your anger, it goes into depression.
Yeah.
Um, because it gets turned inward. And so what a great opportunity to be so physical in
Right.
your anger and be able to murder those trees if you want to use that term. So
Right.
that's great. Wow. So a couple, I had some questions that you and I were going to
Yeah.
dialogue back and forth about. And the first question I wanted to ask you was, of all the things that have occurred since your mom's death, what is the most important thing that you want to share about that?
Yeah, I think that probably at the top comes back to the Viktor Frankl realizations that we've got to make space to embrace those cycles.
Mhm.
Um, as I took that first 1.5 years off from pastoral work, I spent a lot of time gardening. I cleared 1 day a week just to be outside and do physical labor. So a lot of time to think. No music, no podcasts, just quiet. And one of the things that came clear to me one day was my wife and I would accidentally meet up at the garden every afternoon and see the progress of the plants that were growing. And I
Mhm.
said to her one day, "Why do we meet here every day? We don't even plan this." And we end up here at the same time looking at the progress of the vegetables. And she said to me, "It's just so nice to see something growing without our effort."
Mhm.
And as we sat and we pondered on that, we noticed these little worms that were turning into butterflies that were starting to make cocoons.
Mhm.
And I said to her one day, I was like, "Isn't this such a miracle that all this worm is doing is going to sleep? And in a way, it's submitting to a process and it's going to come out something totally different." And I think that when we're in our culture, when we're in making that space, what we get clarity on is how when we're in suffering, we ask the wrong questions. The wrong questions are, how do I fix this? It's a
Mhm.
cultural assumption colored by the Enlightenment that we have all the resources available in our brains to think our way out of this. Where the truth is, you it's like going to bed at night.
Mhm.
You submit to a process, you receive a process that changes you, and you wake up every day and you're a little bit better because of the sleep. And so I think that when we make that space, it allows us to ask a better question. And the better question is, what is it that I actually, what deficiency is being exposed in me right now? Because suffering fast tracks deficiencies to the surface. Which is one of the reasons I think we had such a hard time, is we lived in many deficiencies for years, but we were strong, so we could handle it.
Mhm.
And and so for us, the deficiency was some things that came about our own individual health and and health in our marriage. And so it made space for my wife even to say, "Man, like that's how I deal with this. I'm going to deal with my own things," which fast tracked, 2.5 year journey of her dealing with some stuff into the master's program at Richmond University now that she's in, focusing on trauma therapy. But we wouldn't have ever gotten there
Mhm.
had we not embraced the season of time we were in.
So for you and your wife, both of you guys grieved very differently for your mom. And so
Yeah.
how was that to navigate that in your relationship with her, in and or with your kids and or with your sisters? Because I think one of the challenges for so many families is that when a significant person dies, your mom dies, everybody in your family does your mom's death differently. How
Yeah.
you grieve is differently than, is Amy your wife's name?
Yeah, that's right. Good
Amy,
memory.
than your kids, than your sisters, or whoever else is a part of that immediate clan. And what I often hear when I'm talking to people is like, well, he's not grieving or she's not grieving, and I said, well, how do you know they're not grieving? Well, they're not crying. Well, crying is one aspect of grief, but there's a lot of other
Yeah.
pieces of grief that people experience. And how I grieved my father's death was very different than one of my brothers or one of my sisters.
Yeah.
Very, very different. But all of us grieved my dad in
Mhm.
our own unique way. So,
Right.
how did that impact your relationship with your family, with your grief?
Yeah, great question. With both my sisters, I noticed pretty quick that they grieve differently. My younger sister um, got super busy and was all about tasks and getting stuff done. My older sister was sort of dazed by it. She would wander the house wearing my mom's clothes,
Mm,
and she would look at old pictures and say, "What do you think she was thinking in this picture?"
mm,
And the way I grieved was to try to keep the ship sailing, and not melt down. But interesting about my wife, she wasn't very good at dealing with her emotions for a very long time, which
mhm.
is one of the reasons that led to some of our issues in our marriage, which we had to learn to deal with, that have led to us being in probably the healthiest place we've ever been. We're married almost 20 years now. And the thing about my wife that was really interesting was I'd been gone from home for 6 months.
Mhm.
I was continuing to display pretty heavy signs of grief and grieving. And uh, after we had moved back here, it was another 6 months. So gone 6, home 6, moved to Tennessee 6 months. So we're coming up on, 18 months, getting close to the 2-year mark. And I started to say, I said this to Amy one day, I'm feeling pretty good. Like, I feel like I could, focus, and I'm starting to be able to plan better again and all that. And she said to me, I'm really glad. She said, I want you to also know that I've been holding this thing together for 2 years. She said, I really need some time to fall apart.
Mm.
And she told me that, and it was pretty obvious, but also at the same time, I was sad that I'd missed it for that long.
Mhm.
Then again, she wasn't great at showing it also, and she will admit that. And so my wife's way of dealing with it was to hold things together. But the great thing, I have to believe, that we'll look back on this season of time and we'll say, we learned how to face pain.
Mhm.
And I think that her seeing me face it gave her some kind of roadmap on how she could face it.
Mhm.
And which led to her dealing with a lot of her own story that she had never really dealt with. She also lost a dad many years previous. She didn't quite know how to deal with that. She had some other losses in her life she hadn't really ever dealt with. And it really gave us an on-ramp into, what the grief psychologists would call grief gone public, which is really what mourning is. Grief and mourning are different things.
Correct.
And so we learn together how to bring our grief and make it go public. And so we mourned it together. We mourned not only all the things that we had lost because we started talking about it,
Mhm.
but also we mourned some of the broken things in our relationship that we wanted to find healing. And we found words for those things together. It brought us to probably the strongest place that we've ever been.
So, what a gift.
Oh man,
I mean,
yes.
out of all that happened, what an incredible, incredible
Mm.
gift for both of you and as a couple, and where you can take it, from here on out and use that in multiple other places, which is
Yes.
fabulous.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, there's a term called disenfranchised grief, which is, I was just curious about your 2-year thing, the comment that you made. And so
Right.
disenfranchised grief is a grief that is not validated, it's not spoken about, it is often discounted. And you're now close to 5 years from the time that your mom died.
Right.
And I'm just very, very curious how, if you have felt that you've been that people have disenfranchised you with your grief, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that term disenfranchised grief was something I never heard actually until I met you.
Yeah.
So I have been able to do some thinking about it really as a new concept to me. um, it was a pretty normal thing for
Mhm.
people in a lot of different seasons during this 2-year period I'm describing. Got back to California, and I think people knew I'd been through something hard, but I don't think they really understood. And it was really weird to see life just go on
Mhm.
when I felt like I was just so wounded. And at first, I wanted to smack people like, come on, can't you think of something better to say than been there, done that? A lot of people said that.
Mhm.
And but after a bit I started having compassion for people, and I started having compassion for people because I realized how many we're surrounded with just don't have the tools. It's like, if you think about the tools that we work on a car with or whatever, you can't do certain things without certain tools. And so I begin to have compassion that we are surrounded by people in our culture that are lacking tools to navigate the emotional life. And I've got a lot of thoughts on that because I work in the corporate world, and I think that there's a lot of work to do there. One of the things that I do with uh, the small groups with my church, or even in the corporate world, is I try to help people get in touch with their feelings. And people will say regularly to me, like, I'm not going to do all this touchy feely stuff. Like, I'm not touching you. I'm not going to feel you. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, let's get in touch with our humanity here.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think for me, it actually raised compassion in me when people didn't recognize or understand what was going on in me and with us.
Wow. I use the term SUG moments when I was talking earlier, or people often refer to them as triggers. And triggers are things that are associated with our senses, so things that we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. Do
Mhm.
you find that you continue to have triggers or SUG moments around your mom?
I'll get a sud moment once every few months, 6 months now, not often. I had one the other day. I'm working on building a rental property, and I was listening to some music, and it was some gospel music, and it was talking about believing that the sick are healed and the dead are raised. I got pain all over my hands. I'm by myself at 10 o'clock at night in this property trying to get it fixed. And I find myself just looking out the window to the dark, just covered in tears.
Mhm.
I'm sitting there thinking, I want to believe this so bad
Mm.
in light of my experience. But I think that there are also other triggers that happened a lot more earlier in the process that were a lot clearer, that were a lot less qualitative. Like this whole idea that the sick are healed and the dead are raised. That's a huge idea, huge divine idea. But there were simpler things that would happen. Like, I had a friend who fell from a 40-foot balcony. I went to visit her in the hospital, and she reaches her arms up to move herself on the bed after millions of dollars have been spent repairing her body. And she comes out of this drug-induced coma after a couple of months. And I remember seeing this happen, and my mind's instantly gone back to seeing my mom shift around her in her hospice bed as she's dying.
As she's raising her hands.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And one of the ways that I integrated early on to deal with those triggers was I really wanted to make space to feel the feelings in my body. I started working with a spiritual director, and he said to me, when do you feel most close to God? And I would talk about exercising or being outside, that kind of thing. And he would say, I want you to pray a prayer. And the prayer is, Father, know me. So I don't want you to make any sense of anything. Just ask God to know you, to move through you, to help you, to have him speak his sense into your world. And so I made a lot of space to do things that were not teach me, but meet me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would take those triggers and I would take them out into the woods, and I would ponder and I would think. And what my wife would tell you, by the way, who's getting this, amazing education right now, is there are certain things that our brains haven't made sense of. It's the reptilian brain. Things get locked in this fight or flight space.
Mm-hmm.
So I see my friend move herself in the bed, and my reptilian brain remembers how fast I had to rush to tell my mother to shift her weight, to move her around, to pick her up, to get her on and off the toilet. All that stuff. My emotional part of my brain has not made any sense of it at all. I just know, oh, this is triggering something in me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the key to dealing with that is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist, wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Awesome resource. And what he talks about in The Body Keeps the Score is how people who have suffered something hard and traumatic have a lousy heart rate variability. So their hearts aren't beating correctly and in rhythm. So he says the task that we have to get people into who have been traumatized or gone through something hard, so we got to get their hearts beating normally again.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's where we start. In fact, to try to put somebody through talk therapy who's gone through something they can't make sense of actually just makes their issues worse.
Right.
And so those slow walks, that deep breathing, Father, know me, those prayers, I didn't even know what I was doing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was doing, because obviously you saw the picture of me in the hospital, I'm thinking I'm going to have a heart attack here. But what I was doing was I was getting my heart to beat steady again. So I was taking those things that were triggering,
Mm-hmm.
I was taking them to the quiet,
Mm-hmm.
to deep breathing, and to movement, and opening my hands. And, that's the best thing I could offer to a lot of people who suffer something they can't make sense of.
Yeah.
Just take some walks, get some deep breaths, not exercise.
Yeah.
Slow movement, deep
Right.
breaths. It makes a big difference.
Breathe into your belly.
Yeah, and you know all this stuff. I have not told you anything new, but to me, this was revolutionary stuff to discover.
Oh, and because anxiety is such a huge component with grief, if you can get someone to get their breath into their belly and to breathe out slowly, and I teach kids a lot about belly breathing and breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth and to make sound, and they think I'm just a goof, but it's very soothing, and it's like a internal massage that can often happen if you can get in sync with that. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question. It says
Yeah.
people often are not sure what to say to someone that has had a recent death. What would you have liked for people to say to you early on in your grief after your mom died?
Yeah, probably the best thing, probably two things. One is probably, how are you today, right now?
So how are you right now?
Yeah, at this moment, how are you?
Okay.
Instead of how are you, because really what I wanted to say to people earlier on was, I feel like I'm dying every day, if you really want to know. But how am I right now? I'm doing okay. I just took a walk and I feel calm or whatever. But I think probably the second thing is what I say to a lot of people now who are suffering. And by the way, working as a pastor now for almost 20 years now, I've been around a lot of death, and I think I've handled it with other people okay. I've learned to just be with them, the ministry of presence.
Mm-hmm.
But this experience gave me something that I tell people now that I wish people would tell me too, and that's that I don't share and I don't understand the particulars of your experience, and I just want to tell you I'm sorry. I just can't understand.
Mm-hmm.
But I can understand some of the emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I too have had some loss and some hard things, and I can share some of your emotions with you. And that gives validation to the uniqueness of people's loss. Like I alluded to earlier, when people say they've been there, done that, my thought when people had said that to me was, oh, did you start a business and move across the country and leave your pastoral job? Oh, did you go up and down financially for 5-6 years? Do you know what it's like to live in a hotel, an RV? Do you know what it's like to not have any money to pay your bills? Oh, were you planting a church that you lost? Like, I'm listing all the details in my mind, and I'm so distracted from what they're really trying to say is I also have suffered. And I learned again to have more compassion and not be angry with people. And so I started to reinterpret things people were saying and answer according to what I think they were trying to say instead of being angry at them.
Okay, well, but what a great kind of reframe for you. One of the things that's at my desk is the acronym or the word WAIT.
Yeah.
Why am I talking? And I think one of the things that is so prevalent for people that are experiencing a recent loss or 5 years into a death is sometimes silence and intentional presence can be one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself as well as the person that you're giving that to. Why am I talking?
That's right. Yeah. So I want to ask you something then from your experience. So when you encounter a family and or friends, or one person has lost something and the other person is trying to comfort the person, it'll be okay, God's got a plan, all that. What do you think's behind those words when people are offering them in attempts to comfort? What's really behind it, do you think?
My immediate thought is that we are so uncomfortable talking about death and loss. And how often do we use the term when someone has died, I've lost them. Like one of the things that I educate adults and that are working with kids is you have to be really mindful of your verbiage. So you don't like here in the South. I mean, I'm a California girl. You were, you spent some time there in California. I never went to a funeral where there was a body. It was most people were cremated, or it was a celebration of life service or something like that. Here, it's a very common thing to go and do the viewing and whatnot. And people will often say, that doesn't she or he look beautiful? And I just say yes, because that's the proper thing to do. But how often we, as a culture, do not even use the word death. We use all sorts of other acronyms. They've gone to be with Jesus. That very well may be true. We've lost them. And so one of the things early on in my education around death and grief was using the word death. And so I was working with a 12-year-old, this was many years ago, whose mom was on our service and died from a breast cancer. And so I was talking to her after I worked with her before her mom died, and then after her mom died. And one day we were sitting and talking, and I asked her, how are you doing since your mom died? And she said, Miss Susan, I hate it when you use the word died.
Oh.
And I said, really? I said, okay. I said, well, what word would you rather have me use? And she said, I want you to use the word past. And I said, okay. I said, I am so used to using the word died. I will really work on using, when I talk about your mom passing, I'll use that terminology, but I might mess up. And so she looked at me and she goes, Pinky, will you pinky swear that you will try doing that? And I said, yes. So that was just a really wonderful reminder to me that for her, using the word died was not going to work. In my work with her, I needed to use the word pass. So, I mean, this is just a random question to you. Are there certain words that work better for you than might be for Amy or your kids or your sisters around your mom's death? I'm just curious about that.
That's not one that's come up a lot, honestly, for us. I think maybe what has come up, though, is terminologies. you know, this has really inspired in us a different set of conversations about the nature of life and death and meaning. And so we discuss from time to time certain terms, you know, and what they mean. Especially some of these terms that we're discussing, we've talked about them and what do they really mean. Like Dr. Phelps had mentioned the term complicated grief.
Right.
And so that's an example of terminologies that have been really helpful to find some clarity around.
Right.
You know, so like in my case, you know, one of the reasons this lasted so long for me was because I had a string of losses and starts and stops and restarts, and I had not dealt with any of them. And so what happened was this thing rushed on me like a flood, and there was a string of things that needed to be dealt with that hadn't been dealt with. And so it was like peeling away layers of the onion.
Right. Which is a great term, because complicated grief is basically the type of grief that is present when a number of events or factors influence your experience.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, the death was not sudden, it was a long-term thing, but these are some of the pieces of complicated grief. The death is sudden, the relationship was strained or estranged, that was not you. A death of a child, multiple losses, that definitely was you. And it wasn't necessarily death, it was all the other losses that were going on for you and your family.
Yeah.
A lot of complicated grief can also be like unresolved grief, where the person that was dying suffered, and watching that, which may or may not have been your experience. A limited support system. It sounds like you had a really phenomenal support system, but there are some people that do not have hardly anybody there. And
Right.
that, you know, being able to, there's a lot of aspects of complicated grief. There's a chronic grief, a delayed grief, exaggerated grief, and mass grief, all of which can contribute to someone that's having a very difficult time, which for you was not just during the time that your mom died, but then the 18 months and longer, as you were kind of understanding all the complexities of what was going on with the losses.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and maybe one thing I want to insert in here just as a word of thanks and affirmation for any of our listeners, and also for the people in my life. You know, my story is unusual because I made a lot of space to deal with some things. I could not have done that without a good support system, in particular my wife. But I would say also, the interesting thing about my story is that when word got out about what was going on in our experience, we had a lot of people who donated money so that we could survive financially.
Wow.
I mean, over the course of probably a year, we probably had close to $30,000 given to us.
Wow.
From various people. And I was making enough money to supplement the rest of it because life in California is expensive. But I couldn't have taken the time off to slow down to do that. And also, as a word of thanks and affirmation to the sending church that sent us to California to plant that church, I tried to get out of the support they were paying me because I said, I'm not doing that right now. And they said something to me that will just give you tingles up your spine. One of the elders at that church said to me, brother, I appreciate that you want to let go of the support because you're not planting. But he said to me, he said, but we want you to know you're an example to us. He said, none of us have had to do this. And we want to support what you are doing.
Wow.
And that church actually supported me for 6 months after I moved back to Tennessee financially.
Wow.
And they said to me, we believe that our investment in you is long-term and your example is worth emulating.
Wow. You're very lucky.
Oh my goodness. I'm so thankful. And so I couldn't have done these things without a lot of the support systems. And for those who need that kind of support, would say it's there, but you have to make your needs known.
Yeah. So we have about 15 minutes left. And Dr. Phelps, do you want to come on in, or do you want us to, how do you want us to navigate this?
Well, I thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me put this up. I was going to share my screen. And boy, I got a bunch of screens open. There we go.
Okay.
And then also wanted to mention the upcoming things that we've got. Chattanooga Heart, which is helping everyone attain resources. I'm trying to get back to my sharing my other screen, sorry. Unmute. And that we will also be having Departing in Peace, walking alongside those making end-of-life discussions. And I am trying to show David's book again, which I couldn't show at the beginning because we were having problems with screen sharing. But it's not behaving itself. We wanted to offer the opportunity to our participants to be able to come in and ask questions and have that opportunity. You can use the Q&A function on your computer to ask questions, and we will read them off to you. We had a little bit of fear of being Zoom bombed, so we didn't enable the people to be able to come in and do everything. But if there are questions, please go ahead and post them, and we will proceed from there.
So one thing is, while we're waiting, I would like the participants to know that we have a variety of different support groups with Hospice of Chattanooga that are open to anybody in the community and are free at this time. And tonight we are doing at 6:30 a memorial service for babies that have died too soon. Talking about disenfranchised grief, perinatal loss is one of the most prominent and pieces of around disenfranchised grief, where people do not feel like they have, people understand what it's like to have a miscarriage or have a baby die before birth or shortly thereafter birth. So if you're interested in that, or if you know anybody that would like to participate, it starts at 6:30. Go to our Facebook Live and on to Hospice of Chattanooga's Facebook, and it'll be a live service. And if you are also not interested in doing that, but you know of someone, or you have experienced a death of a baby through a miscarriage or shortly before or after birth, light a candle at 7 tonight, because across the country at 7 p.m. candles are being lit for babies that have died too soon, always on October 15th. So
we do have a question here. I'm working with recovering addicts in long-term treatment center. What advice do you have for those people?
I would say a lot of recovery and people that are dealing with addictions. I would say probably a lot of their issues, whether they have uncovered them or not, have to do with grief and loss, whether it's death or a loss of a lot of other aspects of their world. And so to really name the elephant and ask them to maybe even do a loss line where they start from birth to where they are, and to make a line and look at all the different losses that they've experienced and to begin talking about that.
David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on that. The simplest thing I wanted to add to that one is I have a close family member who struggled with drug addiction, and I went to a meeting with him, and one of the people in that meeting said, I'm learning that my emotions won't kill me. And it's one of the reasons behind substance abuse is not knowing how to feel. And when we don't know how to feel, we want to numb that. And so part of what I said earlier is really applicable here, that to help our human race recover, we've got to get people back into their feelings.
We have another question that says, how do you deal with anniversary dates. My son passed away November 19th, 2018.
Mm.
Anniversaries are often very, very difficult. I encourage people to think in terms of having a plan A, B, and C. Plan A is I'm going to do X, Y, Z on it on this day, and then you start doing it, it doesn't work. So then you go to plan B, and then you go to plan C. And also to remember that it's 24 hours, and it may be you get through that day and the next day is harder, or the day leading up to the anniversary is hard. I would ask that you look at trying to get people to support you as best as you can and to talk about your son.
And
Yep.
I will mention that also hospice follows patients and their families for a year afterwards, in part to get them through those anniversaries, the first Christmas, the first Easter, the first Thanksgiving, without that person.
Yeah, I was going to add also enacting some kinds of simple rituals can also be helpful. My wife's dad died suddenly when he was only 52. And every year on his birthday, what we do is we eat a bowl of spaghetti. We have some popcorn and strawberry ice cream because he loved it. And so that was what we did for him. And
I love it.
it's super simple, funny food, but he just loved it and helps us remember. We tell stories about him. And what my wife had an idea that we try to do on the anniversary of my mother's death, actually. She had learned from reading that what they do in Scotland is they take stones from the land that their family members came from, and they go visit the grave, and they put the stone on the grave so that their family members will know they had been there.
Oh, that's great.
So I'm not saying copy my ritual or that ritual, but if it is, go for it. But we've enacted some things like that. So there's a rhythm like, oh, it's that day, let's grab a rock. Oh, it's that day, let's get the ice cream, you know? And so if that's helpful, I would say try to enact some rituals.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. I again wanted to remind the viewers that we will have October 22nd, Helping Everyone Attain Resources, and then October 29th, Departing in Peace, walking alongside those making end-of-life decisions. More information on the website, which is bookoflifechattanooga.org. This has been absolutely awesome. We are recording it. It'll be on the Book of Life website. It'll be on our supporting institutions websites. David, I think you said you were going to put it on your website.
Yes.
And so I want to thank both of you for a really, really great discussion about this. I've learned a lot, and I've been doing this for 10 years. So, thank you all. And if there are any last questions, if you have, there's a note from Samantha. If you haven't registered for the other two sessions, you can do so here. So last closing comments.
So I would just say grief is a part of life. And one of the best things that you can do, and David has said this throughout his sharing today, is to take care of yourself and to do good self-care. And this is something I say to people all the time, is to make sure that each day you do something kind and gentle for you. So as you lay your head on the pillow tonight, you ask yourself, what was the one thing I did that was kind and gentle for me today?
It's good. Yeah. My last thought also to add to that is more of a quote from a little novel. It's called Grief is the Thing with Feathers. And it's about a family who loses a mother, and there's a crow that happens to become their grief counselor. And he says that I find humans dull except in grief. And the novel kind of chronicles this man's attempts to get on living, and he has such a hard time with it. And near the end of the book, he learns, as he tries to date again and do other things, he says that this concept of moving on is stupid. He said let something to the effect of, let the recovery, let the pain, let the suffering that has been thrust upon us, let no one rush it.
Yeah.
Thought, wow, so good. So don't rush the healing. When a bone is broken, you don't rush the healing. You go and get it put in place, and you wait for the process to work itself.
And to trust the process.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
coming back home and trusting that you can do this.
Hmm.
We have a page of books that by people who've spoken here, but I think you suggest to me that perhaps we should have a list of books that we found helpful. And David, if you can send me that name of that book, we'll start a page of
Yeah.
books that are helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone again for this wonderful participation and these wonderful speakers. This was a great session, and we'll be back again next week. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.